All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to our pre-recorded interview series. We have a very special guest joining us this time. He is the founder of Status Coup and the author of We the Poisoned, Exposing the Flint Water Crisis Cover-Up and the Poisoning of 100,000 Americans. You see his name on the book cover there. Jordan Chariton. Jordan, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course, absolutely. So I want to jump right in. As the book begins, you were living your best life covering the 2016 primary campaign, and you met someone at a rally who implored you to look into what was happening in Flint. And that started what is now essentially a decades long project of yours. So, what made you decide not only to pursue the story, but to stay on it all these years?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of naive at first. I guess, like everyone else, I just assumed that the government doesn't, poison people and leave them to die. So when this woman approached me at a conference, really in the thick of the 2016 election, she was desperate. She was telling me that specifically, like Rachel Maddow, who got a lot of credit in the beginning, in Flint, she did a town hall there, that she was kind of blowing off. Her show was blowing people off at that point, and that everyone had moved on. So it piqued my curiosity just how dire she painted things. She told me about the rashes kids were having, people's teeth were falling out at this point, hair falling out. So I asked Cenk at that point when I was working at the Young Turks to send me there. He did, to his credit, and yeah, very quickly it was like just a real shock. I was seeing front porches stacked with bottled water, cases and cases. A couple homes I went in, just like basic things, dishwashers broken, laundry machines broken from basically toxic water eating it up. A gentleman I met showed me, a plastic bag of his hair that had fallen out. So at first it was just kind of that shock of like, wait a minute, the media is just not even covering this and it's a disaster. So that I wanted to cover the human suffering at first, but the next trip and the next trip, as much as I wanted to cover the human element, I mean, residents were just dumping staggering levels of corruption on my lap. I mean, I didn't even know where to start, because it was not like this just happened, because of one thing. This was corruption that happened for years. So I think what made me keep going back was just really wanting to help the residents, because the media wasn't covering it. But B, I mean, if you're actually like in journalism to investigate things and expose some fuckers, this was a story of a lifetime, because it has everything. It's not just the health, it's not just the water, it's privatization, it's Wall Street banks, greed. So it really just kind of got me hooked, and I got to know a lot of the residents and feel for them over the many trips I took.
You made me a promise, and I must say you fulfilled it. You told me I was going to hate the book, and you're absolutely right. I was talking to Keaton about it as I read it, and I said, okay, so when you're watching one of these Revenger movies, and if it's really good, you're fantasizing about what's going to happen to the bad guys by the end. That's what this book does to you, only if you know the ending. You know that Clint Eastwood is never riding up on the horse to
Yeah.
get these people. Like that's not how this is going to end. Something the book does very well, and I think most people, even people who are kind of in the news business, aren't really clear on, is how you got there. I haven't really seen that covered the way that you covered it. That there was a lot of backstory, tragic moments where things could have gone another way leading up to the switch over to the Flint River. Can you explain what the KWA was and why so many people were so hell bent, in spite of many people who told them over the years, you got to be crazy to put people on that water and to think you're going to treat it with this water plant from the 1950s? Why did they just smash through every guardrail and poison these people? Why were they so determined to switch the water source?
Yeah, I think America, as people are starting to realize, is one giant privatization scam. And this is essentially a decade ago, Wall Street was starting to get involved, particularly with water. You know, oil has always been kind of the global cash cow. Wars fought over oil, but water was becoming a hot commodity. And a lot of banks, landowners, real estate people wanted to get involved with water. So for years, Flint was getting water from Detroit. Detroit, the water that Detroit gave Flint came from Lake Huron, which is one of the Great Lakes. It's some of the purest water you could have. But Detroit was price gouging Flint. So, you know, politicians, residents had like a legitimate complaint that their water rates are continuing to go up. So politicians, and at the time, the Republican governor who wanted to privatize everything, they used the price gouging as an excuse. Well, let's just create our own water system that Flint could join. Theoretically, cities like Flint would control its own rates for water. It sounds reasonable, you know, but in engineering terms, it's kind of unheard of if you have a pipeline that goes, you know, from Detroit to Flint, to build a duplicate pipeline that's going along the same route. It's taking water out of the same source. The only difference was the water Flint had gotten from Detroit was treated water. The chemicals were already in it. You know, chemicals are added to the water to treat it. This was going to be raw water. Well, you need a lot of raw water, not for residents to drink, for fracking, for farming, meat packing, auto business. You need a lot of raw water for business and fracking, which they were fracking the hell out of Michigan at the time. They were kind of open about it. They called it the blue economy. They called water liquid gold. And most of the water in the KWA, which was the new water system that they wanted to build, was not going to be used for residents. It was going to be used for business. And you had landowners, interestingly enough, just buy up land before it was even announced, i.e. insider trading. So the short story is there was a lot of money to be made from a new water system for the Wall Street banks that were going to issue the bonds. Banks are making a lot of money on fronting the money for these new infrastructure projects. Real estate developers, landowners, and politicians, because the politicians that were involved with building this new water system were going to hand out contracts to engineers, and those engineers were going to then essentially give legal kickbacks in the form of campaign donations. But at the last minute, again, Flint, the water was fine getting it from Detroit. It was just the prices kept going up. So Detroit offered Flint at the last minute basically a half off rate, half off discount to stay on Detroit's water system. Flint would have saved money by just sticking with Detroit, but it was never about saving money. It was about basically enriching banks, politicians, real estate developers with a completely unnecessary new water pipeline. And it takes, you know, it would take 2 years to build this new water system. So that's where the Flint River came in. They said, well, we don't want to, if you're Flint, which was nearly bankrupt at the time, we don't want to have to pay to continue getting water from Detroit. And we have to start paying back the bonds for this new water system. So we'll just use the Flint River, which GM, DuPont, Dow Chemical had dumped all their shit in for 100 years. And we'll use this water plant, which was essentially a standing skeleton. It didn't even have functioning equipment. And there's a whole chapter. I mean, literally, the workers at the plant were screaming iceberg ahead a year before they did this, desperately trying to get them not to do it, because they knew, like, you don't have the equipment, you don't have the staff. They were moving people from the garbage department to the water department 2 weeks before the water switch. One plant worker called his sister right before the water switch, told her, contact everyone you know, don't drink the water, people are going to die. So essentially they did this. I don't think the politicians or the bankers and these people consciously woke up and said, let's just kill some poor folks. But I don't necessarily think they cared enough about those folks to do the due diligence to make sure it would be safe.
Well, it seems like one of these just old Tammany Hall schemes where you do a public works project so that you can loot the treasury through it. You actually mentioned towards the end of the book, I can't remember the exact phrase, but there's an industry term for changing the terms of a construction contract. And you mentioned how normally that
change
might
order,
increase yeah, 5 to 15%, and these were like 70% changeovers, which that's classic Tammany Hall stuff. Say you're paying the plasterer 10 times what plasterers get paid. Like it just seems like this old school government kickback scheme. The
Yeah, and
whole
like
idea.
what's unique about this story and why I've stayed on it, I mean, there's scams in America every minute. I mean, that's just the country. It's corrupt. But not all of them are deadly. I mean,
Right.
this is deadly. And the people who engineered it, I really tried in the book to give the backstory, like you said, because most people don't know the backstory. They
No.
just have read in the media, oh, they forgot to add the chemicals and, tragic mistake. It was not a tragic mistake. This was a meticulous plan to basically use these residents as guinea pigs to enrich people. But it's killing people, not just then, because it's been, AI, when you Google things in, it now says, oh, the Flint Water Crisis was, something that happened and ended. It's not over. Cancer's through the roof there. People, kidneys, liver, cancer. I was just there for my book a few months ago. People were still showing me their rashes from the water. I mean, you could see photos and videos on social media as recently as a couple months ago, brown water. Is it as bad as 10 years ago? No. But at the end of the day, it is still a crisis because you don't just poison people with heavy metals, bacteria, and all sorts of things, and then they recover. Some people get cancer very quickly. Some people it takes 5 years, 10 years, and they don't have Medicare for all. All the
Right.
criminal charges have been dropped, which you could thank the Democratic Attorney General for that.
Right.
A lot of them are going bankrupt, having to pay for specialists. So that loops into the, health insurance industry that everyone's been focused on since the CEO's murder. So it is an unfolding cover-up, and they are still trying to bury, with the help of the mainstream media who doesn't care about this, bury the actual culprits who did this, which were Wall Street and local politicians. And that's why I continue digging, because even though I published the book, I'm still trying to get a lot of the information out as to the people who engineered this fraud that poisoned the community.
Well, yeah, on that note, the book, you write early on how you had to peruse through, thousands of pages of government documents and court filings and environmental reports and lawsuits, basically any primary source you can get your hands on. And is that a function of the fact that there was not much reporting on this? Like, you had to basically dig this information out yourself for the most part, because there has been a media blackout of this. So you really, what the thing that's one of many things that's so impressive about the book is that you tell this story, you really get the sense that you dug through the primary sources. You had no establishment reporting to rely on and base your information on. Is that more or less true? I mean, how much of this was just sourced from these very documents that you had to just spend tens of hundreds of thousands of hours rifling through?
It was worse than that, because I had to untangle all the lies that were out there from,
Right.
Michigan outlets, the New York Times, and kind of correct things for myself before I could report accurately. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the thing that really stunned me, I mean, I know the media, this broke nationally in 2016. The media was already way gone. It was all Trump 24/7.
Right.
But I
Right.
was stunned that even the Michigan media wasn't covering this. I mean, literally, I love the people of Flint, but I don't, I wasn't continually going back there because it's a vacation spot. There was no choice but to keep going back, because the Detroit Free Press wasn't covering it anymore. The Detroit News, the Flint Journal, which is like the hometown paper. I mean, residents were dumping the same stuff that they gave me on them. It's just those outlets, for a variety of reasons, didn't want to cover it anymore. So the more times I went back, you build sources, you build relationships. And after a while, I started getting contacted by some higher level sources who I obtained, I mean, thousands of documents from the criminal investigation, and nobody had them. Only I had them. So it was really just, I mean, literally reading like hundreds of pages of criminal interviews, investigative reports, all this stuff. And separating fact versus fiction. So it was a lot. I mean, my wife was not happy with me because there was a lot of weekends just kind of at coffee shops going through this stuff. And it's not just like reading through it. It's then how the hell do you tell this as a story? Because there is no real straight line. It's the federal government's involved. So you got to go through documents, and there's a lot of names and things I didn't naturally know about. Then you got to investigate the state health department, the state environmental department. You have to investigate the county officials, the city officials, and then Wall Street banks. And normally, you know, for example, covering East Palestine, not that a lot of media are covering that, but you could kind of collaborate in a way with others. You know, if there was something I didn't know, I messaged an Associated Press reporter, the only one that's even covering it, and asked him. You kind of compare notes. There was none of that here. It was basically me, myself, and I. So it was very difficult on top of, you know, trying to, as you guys know, keep the lights on here. So doing videos every day, because this was like 2 full-time jobs in itself. Doing this reporting, trying to get national outlets to cover it. That was even, honestly, that was harder in some ways than the reporting, trying to get mainstream media outlets to pick it up, trying to get a mainstream media outlet to publish it. I had 2 outlets kill it the week. Big stories I was doing with them on Flint were supposed to be published for interesting reasons. So it was a lot. It's definitely, you know, I figured to myself, you know what, I'm not going to become like a New York Times bestseller, but if all I could do in my career is get this on paper and get it out, I feel that that's, you know, a career well spent.
All right. A moment where the nation was actually focused on it was right in the middle of the primaries of doom. So the DNC has a debate there. We'll take a look at a clip of this.
On belief that children in Flint, Michigan, in the United States of America in the year 2016 are being poisoned. So I believe the governor of this state should understand that his dereliction of duty was irresponsible. He should resign.
I know the state of Michigan has a rainy day fund for emergencies. What is more important than the health and well-being of the people, particularly children? It is raining lead in Flint, and the state is derelict in not coming forward with the money that is required.
All right. Now, they both promised, I remember this specifically, they both promised that this was not just going to be something they do for the campaign, no matter who wins, no matter what the outcome is. They're going to stay focused on Flint. They're not going to forget about these people. Now, you would know better than I would. As I remember, Bernie went back once, I think. Hillary, not surprisingly, I think forgot about the place as soon as our plane took off and never went back. Do the people in Flint feel like they were used as a prop in that primary and then forgotten by both of them, really?
I think the people of Flint feel like they've been used as a prop, period. And Obama is not someone that they have high opinions of. Bernie went back once, I believe. Hillary never again. And frankly, I mean, hell, Obama was in Flint, I believe, years ago, stumping for Joe Biden in the 2020 election, barely even mentioned the water crisis. So these are, in my view, Obama, you know, a lot of people focus on, oh, he drank the water and that's disgusting. Yes, but Obama, it's worse than that. Flint, it was never issued a disaster declaration. Obama was the president. He did not give it a disaster declaration. If he gave it a disaster declaration, then the feds take over, basically. Right. They could have sent the Army Corps in there, dug up the pipes. It could have been done within a year or two. FEMA, you get, you know, real resources. Right. Biden has not issued a disaster declaration in East Palestine either. East Palestine is Flint 2.0. It might go down as worse because a lot of people are sick there. And they hide behind, well, legally we can't because it's not a natural disaster. They do plenty of shit. When there's a will, they could do it. So he didn't issue a disaster declaration. And as a result, Flint got rump roast. They got short-term Medicaid expansion. for kids 21 and under. So adults weren't covered. Adults got very sick too. And they've gotten a lot of the money. People don't realize, people on Twitter say, oh, what are you talking about, Jordan? Obama's Congress gave Flint $170 million. Go ask the people of Flint how much of that actually went to them, because the governor basically sent it out to special interests. So Obama, in addition to going there with that cheap stunt, didn't do what was necessary for this level of disaster. You better believe they would have if it happened in Ann Arbor, an hour down the road, wealthier, whiter. So Obama deserves a lot of credit, but all these politicians, even, Bernie, who I think, genuinely cares more than Hillary. I can't tell you how many times I've sent my stories to Bernie's people, the few progressives in Congress. I mean, literally, I'm not even asking them to publicly say anything, just take action behind the scenes. No response. Of course, they get a lot of requests, yada, yada. But basically, it's not just Flint. I mean, there's so many communities where shit like this happens that once after the breaking news, the train explodes or the long lines of people waiting for water, it's out of sight, out of mind. And honestly, the worst of it comes years later as people, because with heavy metal poisoning, the damage, it takes several years to get truly, truly bad. So I've been there over 20 times, and people I met the first or second time, they're either dead now or they look like they've aged 30 years in 10. And so that's why I have a very hard time with all this bullshit about democracies at stake and democracies. This is not democracy if Americans are being poisoned by their government and then it's covered up and they're left to slowly die. I mean, that in a nutshell. Why have I kept covering it? Because this, to me, there's nothing more important than water, just as a fact. You can't live without it for longer than a few days. And to me, everything else, there's a lot of important issues, but everything else is theater if essentially we're becoming the United Sacrifice Zones of America.
Well, what's especially just confounding about Bernie and the progressives who you tried to get to cover this is their theory of the case when they run in a primary is we're going to mobilize people who never vote. We are going to inspire people who feel fucked over by the system entirely, who never vote. We're going to get them to the polls. They're going to vote for us. That's how we're going to win. So if that's your theory of the case, you should be launching your campaigns in places like Flint and like East Palestine, Ohio, because those are the people who you say you can mobilize. And yet, when push comes to shove, when the moment is right, they get ignored. And I think that speaks to what you're saying about democracy. Is it because there's no money to be raised from poor people who are fucked over? Is that what it is? Because if this was about getting votes and you're progressive and your theory is of the case is that you're going to mobilize disaffected people, you would pay special focus. If I were going to launch a campaign, I'd launch it in Flint, Michigan.
Yeah, I think, honestly, it's one thing I've seen, whether it be Flint, East Palestine, doesn't matter. I mean, the majority of people are not as tribal as, like, the media. They're not as hardcore like blue or left. I mean, blue or red. Even when I covered Bernie's campaign and Trump's campaign in 2016, a lot of Trump's people were telling me their second choice was Bernie. They said they didn't agree with him on everything, but authenticity, they agreed with him on trade, this and that. So, I mean, at its core, most people, they might be more conservative or liberal on certain things, but economically, a lot of them, are with us on progressive issues and are very, very feel left behind, feel screwed over by the government, are very cynical. So somebody like Bernie or other progressives should have been actively campaigning in Flint, places like Detroit, which have had similar problems, East Palestine. But, they have their consultants in there and, fixated in Iowa and New Hampshire and this and that. But I completely agree with you. I mean, I think somebody like Bernie, although I respect a lot of what he's done in recent years, I think he has very much played this inside game, thinking that if I have a seat at the table, you might have a seat at the table, but you're still at the kids' table. So I totally agree with you. I think progressives should have been focused on the Flints of the world, the East Palestine. I mean, Kalamazoo. Fuck, there's still problems with Love Canal. So I completely agree.
All right, you mentioned that very famous Obama clip. I'm gonna play it for anyone. I would imagine our audience has seen it. but just in case. And I have a question for you that I've always had about this.
The reason I know I'm okay is because I already had some Flint water. There we go. I really did need a glass of water. This is not a stunt. Now, I'm going to talk about this. Everybody settle down. This is a feisty crowd.
All right, so this is March 2016, at the height of the crisis. You're describing in your book people with lead levels of 700 times the legal limit for lead at the time that he's pretending to drink this water. Now, this is a Republican governor. Why did he do that? What I've never understood it, what his motivation was to cover for them. Why he didn't, from what I understand, and you would know better, the EPA was part of this whole cover-up of what was going on. Why didn't he order his Justice Department? Because clearly, as you talk about in the book, this is exactly the kind of a case that the feds are supposed to step in on, where the local government is so corrupt that it can't be trusted to investigate itself. It's a Republican administration. You can understand if he's covering for a Democrat who did this. Why? What was the motive?
So that's a very good question. I can't get in his head, but my theory, based on my reporting, I think he and the Democrats to this day are protecting JP Morgan and Wells Fargo. So let me break it down for dummies, because it gets complicated, this whole story. Essentially, Flint was nearly bankrupt a decade ago. Like right. Detroit and many other cities, they were just, offshoring of jobs, white flight, nearly bankrupt. Flint didn't even have like a legal credit rating, so it couldn't borrow money in 2014. But to build this completely unnecessary new water system, it was going to cost nearly $300 million. So the county that Flint is part of, they were funding most of that, but they needed Flint to be able to borrow about $100 million to complete right. the funding. Well, Flint couldn't borrow any more money. So how does a broke city borrow $100 million? That's where the banks stepped in. So the banks, which I don't want to bore people, but they're making crazy money off of these municipal bond deals, which are probably happening where you live. You just don't know about it. The banks, along with the unelected emergency manager, that's another element. The Republican governor put in basically a czar to run the government, overtaking the power right. of the mayor, the city council. They created a fake emergency. So Flint could borrow money if there was like an environmental emergency. So they concocted some stupid thing about we need to clean up a lime pit next to the water plant.
Yeah, it was like a $2,500 problem, you said.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. And through the back door of that, here's $100 million to help fund this this completely unnecessary water system. The original Flint water prosecutors, that's another element of this cover-up, because the Democratic Attorney General basically torpedoed the case. The original investigators, they were actually going after that scam that I just told you about, and that could have indicted and implicated Wells Fargo and JP Morgan, because they issued the fraudulent bonds. The bonds were based on...
Yeah, you say they were putting together a RICO case that the Democrats torpedoed.
Yeah, so I broke in 2022 for The Guardian that they were basically on the 5-yard line, the original prosecutors, of charging RICO. For you soprano aficionados, that was started in like the 70s to go after organized crime. It's usually bribery, corruption, money laundering kind of stuff. And they were about to charge, to my knowledge, both Democrat and Republican officials. But as part of that RICO case, it was going to implicate the Wall Street banks also. Who breaded Obama's butter? The Wall Street banks. Who breads Gretchen Whitmer's butter? She's the governor of Michigan. Wall Street banks, Republicans too. They're all in on it. So the Wall Street banks, who were sued civilly in 2020 over their role, because as part of this contract for this new water system, the banks were supposed to do the due diligence to make sure that the water plant could treat the water. Obviously, they didn't do that. So to me, I think Obama, he says, well, I trusted my EPA officials who told me they were on it. No, I think from Obama's level and below, they didn't want to touch this because it implicated Wall Street. And by the way, I know for a fact there were official investigators who on the Flint Water criminal team that brought this to the FBI. They thought the FBI should be in on this.
Right.
FBI didn't want to touch it either.
Right.
So, I could only speculate. I don't have this, hard fact. But when Wall Street banks are involved, when it was a privatization scheme, when it will implicate, yes, the Republican governor, but there were local Democratic officials too. I think that was basically why Obama, in addition to the condescending tone there, put this aside. And to this day, not as high level official as Obama, but the Attorney General of Michigan, Dana Nessel, who she was at the DNC, she's a lesbian, telling Trump, "You'll take my wedding ring over my dead cold body." The crowd loved it. She's very woke. MSNBC has her on all the time. She will not provide documents I've requested. In fact, her office told me they didn't have the documents I requested. I requested specific documents on that racketeering case. She told me they don't have the documents. I knew that was a lie. I threatened to sue them. Then they saw Jesus and said, "We'll look again." Then they magically found the documents and told me, "We can't give them to you because legal statute, bullshit. So bottom line, this was a Wall Street privatization scam that poisoned 100,000 people. And their goal is just to kick the can down the road until everyone forgets about it. The media has forgotten about it. And I'm, maybe I'm naive. Maybe I'll die trying, but I'm going to continue digging because I don't think it's just about Flint. We're seeing the playbook they used in Flint in East Palestine. I've covered other stories in Kalamazoo and elsewhere where the EPA just lies. The state lies, either at the behest of corporations or other entities. The media reprints the lies and everybody moves on.
Well, this is part of what I think goes against the narrative that people expect, particularly people who are Democrats or liberals. The bad Republicans were going to let them get away with it, and the good Democrats would bring justice. And what you describe is quite the opposite, where the GOP AG actually appointed an independent prosecutor who was competent and qualified, who had a lead investigator who had run the Detroit FBI office, had been involved in Gambino crime family investigations. They knew what they were doing. And as soon as the Democrat comes in, makes a bunch of moves that make absolutely no sense, where you're just basically looking at it from the outside. We can't know. It looks like you're trying to kill the case without saying you're trying to kill the case by putting a bunch of people on it who are not in any way qualified to investigate a case like that and firing everybody who was about to really hold these people accountable. It plays as a microcosm of America, where if you're rich, you could literally murder a city. You could literally murder a city and you're good. You're good. You're too connected. You're too big to fail. You know too many of the right people. And if you're poor, it doesn't matter. You can't vote your way out of it. There's nobody you can vote for who's going to do anything for you. I mean,
I think that this one thing that I've noticed, which is a good thing, I think, is this has opened up the eyes, not just of Americans, but the actual people in these communities. Because I was talking to people in Flint around midterms 2018 that were like jumping for joy that Gretchen Whitmer was elected. Because, the guy who poisoned them are leaving and they're believing that she's going to deliver justice. She said she was going to reopen the shut down water stations that the governor shut down. All she gave Flint was a state park. She didn't reopen anything. And she's basically, she knew that the water testing was manipulated and that basically her predecessor manipulated the data, meaning who knows what the actual lead levels truly were. She hasn't done anything for Flint. And the residents I talked to that were understandably, they thought the Democrat was going to fix it. They can't stand her. And that's not a few people. I'm talking like widespread. They were not jumping for joy for Kamala Harris either. I saw when I was in Detroit and Flint before the election, depressed enthusiasm, particularly among black voters. It's a majority black city. East Palestine, which is majority conservative, overwhelmingly voted for Trump. A lot of folks there are not enamored with Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. They felt that he showed up in the beginning, kind of took a photo op looking in the creek at the chemicals, and then stopped answering them. So I think a lot of folks, whether it's a Democrat leaning area or Republican leaning area, they're realizing like all these people are full of shit. None of them are sticking with us, and we're on our own. And that's why I call it, this is a bipartisan cover up. Yes, the people in real time were poisoned under a Republican administration, but the Republicans couldn't get away with it without the current Democratic governor and the Democratic attorney general. And you said it doesn't make sense. It makes sense on the Wall Street end, but politically,
Right.
this could make your career, if you're Gretchen Whitmer or Attorney General Nestle, to nail Wall Street or to nail the Republican predecessor. I mean, you could ride off to higher office off of bringing justice to the poison. So to me, politically, it makes no sense, but it makes sense if you are a purchased government official by Wall Street.
Well, one thing that really just speaks to the rapaciousness of the system, you mentioned a couple times, earlier in the interview about the privatization and the commodification of water. And I'm going to read this very brief passage from the book. You're recounting your experience at a town meeting. I also asked why the Snyder administration was allowing Nestle, the billion-dollar corporate behemoth, to pump hundreds of millions of gallons of water per day from Michigan's Great Lakes for an annual permitting fee of $200. What sense did it make, I asked, that Nestle could essentially steal water from Michigan's pristine aquifer only to bottle it and resell it to the poisoned residents of Flint? With the abundance of clean water in Michigan, wasn't there enough to be provided to Flint for free in the middle of a water crisis? So Nestle is like one of the worst offenders that we all think of when we talk about the commodification of water and just labor practices, right? One of the most evil of the food corporations on earth. Then we learn, obviously, just the image of people buying water in the middle of this is horrible enough. Then you learn that Nestle's bottling Michigan's own water and selling it to the residents at a profit. Like, to me, like, that was just one of the most infuriating things. I didn't know they actually got the water from Michigan. Do you know how they were able to essentially get a free license for that? I mean, $200 is literally free for them. I mean, it may as well be free.
Well, at the time, the Republican governor's chief of staff's wife was a VP at Nestle, so no conflict of interest there.
Wow, that's amazing.
And Nestle, I mean, it's honestly, it's less complicated, more sinister than we think. But I mean, Nestle's lobbying to federal and state governments is through the roof. Same thing with United Healthcare and all the rest. So between the lobbying, the direct donations, the PAC donations, hey, give them the water. We're making tenfold off of Nestle. I'm talking about the government's perspective, but it's insane. And I mean, I had experiences there. I talked about a woman in Flint. She was sitting on her porch, young mother. Her 1-year-old was sitting on her lap with white sores all over her. They had just moved into Flint, and her skin was perfect before that, but she had all these white sores from bathing, and she was considering calling Child Protective Services on herself because she couldn't get them water. She didn't have a car. Almost 20% of residents don't have transportation, and it's expensive to buy bottled water. And I know as a journalist, you're supposed to be a neutral robot. I went to go buy her a few cases of water because I'm not going to leave this woman and her kids without water. So that's what was going on. The governor had shut off the free water stations. The current governor did not follow through on her promise to reopen them. And poor people are left to drink out of a toxic tap because they can't afford bottled water. And they're only left with either donations at churches, which, are hot and cold. Sometimes there's more donations, sometimes there's not, or go buy bottled water Nestle has stolen. So it's truly sick. I mean, there are war crimes about starving or, not providing food or water to your prisoners. Here, you have American citizens basically being deprived water, which should be free anyway. That's another story, but that's what was going on. And frankly, I think one of the frustrations I've had is just, to me, I'm biased because obviously I'm close to the story. To me, this exposes the true levels of corruption in America but most people, even in Flint, don't know the full story. And that's the frustration, that the media and the government have done such a good job at just sweeping this under the rug.
Well, when you talk about, water being expensive, I mean, yeah, even if you're just talking about drinking it, it adds up when you buy bottled water. But people got to remember, they're not just buying bottled water to drink. They need to wash their hands with it. They need to bathe in it. Like just think of if no water came out of your tap and you had to use bottled water for everything, to bathe, to wash hands, to wash dishes or plates, whatever. I mean, you're talking about the money really adding
cases of water.
Yeah, cases
There were
and
people.
cases a day.
There were people there using like 150 bottles a week to bathe their, their kids, cooking, even brushing your teeth. So, I mean, it's stuff we take for granted, but it absolutely, it is a crime against humanity, and it's a double crime. The fact that no one is going to be held accountable, and that, a lot of people might think this is only about Flint. It's not, because if they could get away with what they did there, good luck if it happens to you. It might not be water in your city. It could be fracking. It could be mining. It could be a chemical plant goes on fire. There's people in Georgia sick right now because of a chemical plant that unleashed chlorine gas. And if nobody is held accountable for what they did in Flint, I fear the same thing's going to happen elsewhere.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. You went out on a tour a few months back of poisoned water around the country. How widespread is this problem? How many people's drinking water is unsafe?
Man, I wish I knew the true answer, because a lot of people think it's only lead, but there's so many other problems with water, from plastics to PFAS, which are the forever chemicals they're finding. I mean, they're finding arsenic in water. I mean, they're finding things like chloroform, which, if you ever watched The Mask with Jim Carrey, they put the thing to make you unconscious. Water is contaminated at high levels or low levels throughout the country, even in wealthy areas. It doesn't stop just like in the poorer areas, because most of the pipes underneath us are about 50 to 100 years old. Right. In Newark, New Jersey, where they have a lead problem, they were finding pipes built in the 1800s that were still under the ground. So that's point number one. Point number two, I mean, people think the EPA suddenly became bad under Trump. No, the EPA has been horrible for forever, because the EPA, like many agencies, part of their mission statement is economic development. So we have regulations that are not actually being deployed. So corporations are dumping their shit all over the country. I was in West Virginia a few months ago. They're finding like green fungi looking algae in the water, and hundreds of residents on well water were getting sick because the coal mines were intentionally flooding their mines. So essentially, there's water problems all over the country, whether it's the infrastructure is corroded or old, or corporations directly dumping into rivers, creeks, reservoirs, and it's barely regulated. It really isn't. Not just under Republicans, under Democrats, who are supposedly have tighter regulation. And honestly, I mean, there's people in my life that I've said who had no family history of cancers. We're healthy, suddenly get cancer. You wonder, because water, particularly the PFAS, those forever chemicals, they cause cancers, miscarriages. So yeah, there's problems all over the country. The other problem is the cops that are supposed to police this. So your water department, the state environmental department, I mean, they've been caught cheating on water testing and cutting corners all over the place. So it's, as I note in the book, there's a reason that Wall Street started trading water as a commodity in 2020. And I believe that reason is they rightly believe there might be a shortage of clean water at some point in the near future. And I don't want to be dramatic, but wars have been fought over oil. So I don't know why we wouldn't expect wars over water.
Well, one of the names. Sorry, go ahead, Russell.
Yeah, I was going to say go to your East Palestine question, because I definitely want to get that in.
One of the names that jumped out at me in reading the book was Mark Durno with the EPA, and I recognize that name because he was the focus of a good deal of your East Palestine reporting. So this is from June of 2023. You put this out as an exclusive. In recording obtained by Status Coup, EPA official admits there's no evidence to support Norfolk Southern's decision to detonate 5 toxic vinyl chloride cars in East Palestine, Ohio. And then you put out a couple of these recordings. These are brief, so we will just play them to catch the audience up.
Has always been Wi-Fi.
Yeah, Wi-Fi.
Because 4 of them were been perfectly fine.
4 of them, the way I understand it from our guys who were on site, is that 4 of them were not showing signs of stress yet. 1 was, and 1 was getting close.
Was that one?
So
in
why?
the 4th?
And then we had 2 burn pits, right? So
Right.
that tells me that, let's say 1 could influence 1 or 2 others. What about the other 2?
Have you guys stopped any flow to
So those are some of the hold that thought.
Oh, okay.
So those are some of the questions that I think are going to come out as NTSB's coming here at the end of the month.
Yeah.
I think those will be
I
some
think that
questions.
there's a lot of stuff that's going to come out with them.
Yeah.
But
There's an investigative side of this that hasn't even
Right.
started yet. You know, I worked up in Flint for 1.5 years, and that investigation is still going.
So here is the second piece of this. Durno also admitted the detonation of the cars was an open burn, which is prohibited by EPA regulations. This contradicts months of claims by EPA and Norfolk Southern calling the procedure a, quote, controlled burn. You could consider that an open burn. In an emergency situation, it is what it is. We'll play the first minute or so of this.
You know how last week I brought up the thing about that being an open burn? And you said that it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you could, yeah. So what
Yeah.
I said was, yes, you can consider that an open burn.
Okay.
Right? No, but in an emergency situation, it is what it is.
Then I printed this out from, I don't know where it's from, but it had said, like, you can't do open burns at like sunset, or they have to be out by sunset.
Okay.
So like that happened about an hour before sunset. Well, that's when it got dark at my house.
That's right. No, it did. It happened. It was still burning at sunset. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
And then when there's a temperature inversion, does that mean that kind of inversion that happened?
So interesting thing about the inversion. So first of all, you're right. You know, all the open burn regulations would apply, but in an emergency situation,
Okay.
you know, there are a lot of things that we do. We're actually exempt. If we were doing that work, we're actually exempt from those types of regulations because it's an emergency. Right?
Okay.
Now, the company's not necessarily. So there could be significant fines and penalties levied based on their actions.
Was it?
So there's a lot there. First of all, that it's incumbent upon people to research these regulations and read them to guys like Mark Durno. That's just amazing. But then the second thing, you just said in the previous question about how, people are under the impression that Trump the EPA and that it was especially bad under him. But what you see in a guy like Mark Durno is a permanent state bureaucrat who has been present through crisis after crisis, and there seems to be no accountability within the agencies either. So how does a guy like Mark Durno go from Flint to East Palestine? And then more broadly speaking, and you've touched on this in the past, but what are some of the key similarities and differences between these two instances, Flint and East Palestine, Ohio?
So Mark Durno and people like him are just basically bureaucratic cleanup men. They're sent in essentially to lie and to do cherry-picked, bullshit testing to, not, quote, create a panic. I don't know. I can't get in his head. I don't know if he knows what he's doing. He's putting out misinformation, or if he just has drank the Kool-Aid at the EPA. But he did similar stuff in Flint. You could ask the people of Flint. He was, telling them, don't believe your lying eyes. Oh, this could just be eczema on your skin. Minimizing the lead levels. In my book, I talk about manipulated testing. And in the case of Flint, first of all, Mark Durno pretty early on admitted that the testing equipment the EPA was using was inadequate, that they're basically using equipment that you would use to detect chemicals in an industrial plant, which you're looking for very high levels. But here you're trying to detect it in the air. So he said, yeah, we could be missing, quote, lower levels of chemicals. common sense. You don't blow up 5 cars, over 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride, which is toxic, cancer-causing gas, and it just disappears into the air and no problem, right? And it doesn't just stop at a mile, which is, they only evacuated a mile. So essentially, Durno, he just very casually says some things there. But number one, why was the EPA is not the janitor. The EPA is the federal government. They were there after the derailment and burn. Why were they allowing the company that crashed make the decisions to detonate these cars? He's acting like they were just a bystander, like, yeah, why? Well, if you had some questions, why did you allow it? You're the federal government. This wasn't like a states' rights issue. The EPA could have stopped Norfolk Southern from detonating these cars, which we found out even last year that they didn't have to blow up these cars. Norfolk Southern, it wasn't just a mistake. They knew, and they were being advised by the owner of the chemicals on the train, that the temperature of the cars is cooling, meaning there's no urgent risk that these cars are going to blow up. They blew up the cars to open up the tracks faster. Norfolk Southern actually got caught burying contaminated soil underneath the tracks. The EPA only ordered them to dig it out because the residents were screaming about it. So essentially, this is, I don't agree with RFK on much, but on this I do. I mean, this is regulatory capture. The EPA has been, like many other industries, agencies, has been purchased. There's a revolving door. You have EPA officials who then go work for chemical companies and oil companies, and there's oil execs and chemical execs that then come run the EPA. So Durno, he's casually just stating there, oh yeah, it was an open burn, so we've lied to the public. Open burn just meaning an uncontrolled chemical inferno.
Right.
Let's do away with the technical terms. They unnecessarily nuked Ohio and Pennsylvania. I've spoken with toxicologists that have said this plume went as far as 8 states, including Canada. So it's not just East Palestine. And why have a federal government if they're just going to stand there and let multi-billion-dollar corporations basically create sacrifice zones? That's what happened here. And I could tell you, might seem anecdotal, I've been there twice this year. I got sick both times. And I don't suffer from headaches normally.
Did.
Yeah, I got sick both times I was there.
Wow.
Well, our friend Savage Joy says, Savage Joy, obviously, she says the same thing. We've had her on a few times following her trips there, and she says, yeah, she gets sick every time she goes.
Oh, I walked into a couple's house. They had purifiers going, fans going, just so the audio would work. I asked them to turn it off. I had like a mild headache with the fans on when we turned it off so that the audio would be crisp. I mean, I felt like I was drunk or something.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how chemically contaminated it is. And you have people like Mark Durno telling them everything's fine. And, I don't want to get too technical, but at the end of the day, you have EPA, but you also have CDC, FDA. They're basically regulating based on conditions in the 1970s. In this case, you have as many as hundreds of chemicals coming out all at once, because it's not just the vinyl chloride released that creates other chemicals through, byproducts, but their regulations, they're only testing for individual chemical exposure. But it's not just individual chemicals people are being exposed to. It's basically a chemical petri dish. And at the end of the day, I don't really care, progressive, conservative, this and that. At the end of the day, most people believe that if you are in the wrong place at the wrong time, if the government or corporations fuck up, that they should relocate you if you want to move, that they should pay for your health care, your testing, whatever expenses. I mean, they rush through a settlement in this case. I've never seen a settlement this quickly in just a year. It's crumbs compared to the true damage, and people are very sick. I mean, I have people texting me from there every day. People are dying, new cases of cancer. I interviewed an 18-year-old who was having seizures, perfectly healthy before. There's young children, like 6, 7, 8-year-old girls having early menstrual cycles. And meanwhile, the EPA is saying everything's fine. And Norfolk Southern is on CNBC talking about oh, we did so much for these people, and here's our stock buyback. I mean, it's really fucked up, and it's equally fucked up that the media doesn't want to cover it. I've broke several stories on this that I know an Associated Press reporter followed up on my reporting with some of my sources in East Palestine, confirmed it, that it was correct, and then never reported it. And I asked the reporter, why are you sitting on this? Oh, it's on my list of things to do. I mean, you literally have a company that criminally, in my opinion, nuked Ohio and Pennsylvania, and there's not even an investigation. J.D. Vance was in a Senate hearing a few months ago. The head of the NTSB told Vance, the cars were cooling. There was no reason for them to do this. Norfolk Southern ignored the experts telling them not to do it. Vance, in his words, said, it sure seems like this town was poisoned to open up to move freight quicker. I emailed his office after, you're going to call for an investigation? Nothing. So it's not just Vance, it's all of them. Sherrod Brown, when he was in office, same thing. Honestly, if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time and something bad happens, whether it's the water or the trains or whatever, good luck.
Yeah, no, people who it sounds like you either have to have the money to be able to move on a dime, on a moment's notice, or else you're screwed.
Right.
Like if you don't have the money to just get out of there, you're fucked.
All right, so I want to close out with a kind of broader philosophical question, Jordan. You're in an interesting position. You're like this old school muckraking reporter without particular allegiance to a political party. You get this front row seat to just the total illusion of democracy that we have in this country. Now, during the election, I think it was very confusing for a lot of people on the left trying to figure out what you could possibly put your energy into that's worthwhile under these circumstances. We were supporting Jill Stein in deference to the Palestinians who were backing that path. But clearly the system goes on undisturbed by our efforts. Do you feel a lot of people we speak to who are very radical say, capitalism is always going to end up in a place like this. It just doesn't work. You just can't have that system. It's always going to end up in this late stage capitalism place. Do you feel that capitalism is irredeemable, that it's always going to end in Flints? Do you feel it can be reformed? And what actions do you feel people can best take under our circumstances right now to stop things like East Palestine and Flint from continuing to happen?
Yeah. For the record, I voted for Jill Stein, so just throwing that out there.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So it's been tough for me because I don't want to tell people don't vote. It doesn't matter. I mean, I particularly on the local level, I think it does matter because local politics really affects you. But I've been saying probably for a year or two, I mean, personally for me, I've shifted my focus to outside of electoral politics, especially my coverage. I mean, the most enthralled I've been in a while was covering the UAW strikes last year. I don't think they got everything they should have gotten. I don't agree with all the tactics, but overall, that was the first time I've seen a pulse in a long time for organized labor. And, I'm going on a decade on the ground. So at this point, you see trends. And I think people, including me, you have to stop putting all your apples into one hero, whether it be Bernie or, a band of a squad. We saw how that worked out. And I think people, I look to France. You try to raise the retirement age there, they fucking storm the Bastille.
Yep.
Right.
Figuratively. And part of why they do that is they have some basic safety nets as citizens, healthcare, stronger regulation, etc. Here, I'm tired. I'm not knocking protesters, but we've covered the Palestine protests for over a year. It hasn't changed much because people are just kind of circling the same blocks, chanting the same shit over and over again. Now we see the protests in New York over this black man that was killed in the prison. I've been saying we need to economically organize. I don't think there's going to be a general strike overnight. I don't think that's realistic, but I would love to see people shift their energy into creating economic organizing, even if it starts, local, boycotts of corporate banking, your local bank, your local grocer. You see what they did in Canada with the protest during COVID. You know, a lot of people didn't like what they did for whatever reason, but I mean, they were shutting down commerce and the bridge between, and they got shut down very quickly. Well, to me, we've seen that we could mobilize millions of people. It happened in 2020 over George Floyd, but none of that was economic. It was all people protesting in the streets. So to me, I mean, I don't put a lot of stock anymore in, you know, team red, team blue. I think the only color that matters is green. I cover elections because part of my thing is to cover the news. But to me, I'd like to see people economically organizing in their local communities. I'd like to see people, even if it starts, I'm sorry, boycotting Amazon for the first day of the month isn't going to do much. But even if it starts with, you know, short-term boycotts, I think attached to those boycotts, instead of donating to politicians or just as Democrats, we need to create a mutual aid pot so we're not screwing the actual workers that are hurt from these strikes. But that's where I'd like to see things go, because I think we've seen, listen, I mean, you could have elected Bernie, even if you become president. I'm not even sure we'd have Medicare for all. He might have tried, but it might have been stuck in a million lawsuits and then struck down by the court. So this system is far too corrupt for one president to save us or getting more progressives elected to Congress. I don't think it's an either or. I think a lot of things can be done at once. But to me, we need to become a lot more aggressive in terms of what we do outside of electoral politics. And that starts with corporate banking, big box retailers. I don't know why people are still using Amazon at this point. I get it's convenient, but you hurt Amazon economically, you might start to see some change because Bezos will get on the phone. I mean, Elon Musk is basically running the government now. Right. So to me, that's where things should go. I know on the internet, you know, people want you to pick a side, this and that. Right. I could not vote. I voted for Biden in 2020. I got a lot of shit for that. I couldn't vote for Harris. I'm not going to support a genocide, full stop. But to me, even if people want to focus on third party, that's fine. But if we're not actually organizing economically instead of just boots on the ground, protesting with our wallet, they can't send the police to all our homes and force us to order Amazon. So to me, that's where I'd like to see things go philosophically.
Well, you know, the UAW said they want to organize for a general strike in 2028, and I think that's a good North Star. Now, of course, we talked to Shama Sawan about general strikes, and of course, she's supportive of the idea, but she makes the very important point that you can't just call for a general strike until you have an organized workforce. And so I think that is really the project for the next few years, leading up to that in 2028, the next national presidential year. If we can organize enough workers to just stop the system, stop it and say it does not start again until it does so on our terms. At that point, it doesn't matter who the president is. Democrats, Republicans, they need a system to preside over. They need an economy to run in order for them to do anything. So I think that is hopeful. And one last follow-up, I know you have to go. Your channel has really hit a stride, and it's very well deserved based on your pro-Palestine protest coverage, the Luigi Mangione coverage. I assume you kind of feel as Russ and I felt, which was restrained by the presidential campaign. That could not have been over soon enough, because to me that seems so fake. It seemed like the real politics are what you're talking about now. So what is it like as a creator in this game? As like we said, we all got to keep the lights on. We all got to do videos that are going to get people to click on them. Some people deride that as clickbait. Hey, if you don't click on the videos, we don't have a project. So what is the challenge of that and the opportunity of that? And do you feel like there's more opportunity now that the campaign is over?
Yeah, I felt torn because honestly, I didn't want to cover the election. But you kind of
it seems that way. It seems like you've been trying to move away from that kind of content,
and so have we.
Yeah.
For the most part.
So you know, I said to my cameraman, let's do the swing states, but not even really focus on the election. Let's just focus on stories in these states that actually probably matter to voters and might make a difference, but the media is not covering. So we were covering water being fucked up, gentrification, East Palestine we stopped in. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the challenge, because for me, it's always like, all right, I think the best videos are things I'm actually passionate about.
Right.
For example, I don't, you know, Jimmy Carter died, I don't really have anything to add. Oh, I'm not going to do a video on it, but that's in the news. That's in the algorithm. So it's always kind of that balancing act. But for me, like the Luigi Mangione and the United Healthcare has been the perfect story because it is something I'm passionate about. It's not just about healthcare. It's about capitalism and this corrupt system we've been talking about. And it just happens to be hitting the right stride and people care about it. So for me, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to stay away from electoral politics if it doesn't make sense. It's the same mentality I've had about Trump for years. I mean, I don't have much to add on Trump that's not being covered ad nauseum by everyone else. So when I cover him, I want it to be from a unique angle or something different. So that's kind of how I look at electoral politics. I'll cover it if it's something I could add new or valuable. And yeah, I mean, in terms of status quo, there were a lot of moments I thought the lights were going out and it was tough. And I'm not naive. I mean, we're having a great period now, but I'm sure this game ebbs and flows. You have highs and lows, but to me, it's always a good thing if you're offering something that others aren't. So hopefully the on the ground reporting is our North Star. And we're seeing more people that find us now are liking it and find it valuable. So
we've been very glad to see you having an explosion in viewership because you're covering things that people need to be exposed to. It's very nice to see it not being a video about how woke Disney is doing very well.
And the cool thing is now, you know, if you have a video on Mangione that goes viral, then when you cover the Amazon strike, that video is not going to do as well as the Mangione video, but it'll do better than it would have had you not had the Mangione because you pull in all those subs. So now the videos that used to get 500 views are getting 5,000 views.
I used to, on Flint, if I was lucky, I'd get 1,000 views. Now we just did one with 20,000. Amazon strike. We covered the Amazon union campaign strikes. Maybe it got 5,000 views. We just did a video that got 200,000. So that's kind of like, that's been the great part about this, that the real like core stuff we want to put out there and people see to wake people up, frankly, is getting more eyeballs. So I'm very grateful. And I appreciate also you guys having me on the book because it's not easy to publish a book right before the election and get attention on it. So it's helpful to get the word out.
All right.
Appreciate your time, man.
Absolutely. The book is called We the Poisons. We will put a link to purchase it when we put this full interview up for the general public. You're live for our subscribers right now. This will be up later in the week for the masses, but subscribe to Status Coup and find the book We the Poisons anywhere but Amazon, I'm assuming. Jordan cannot endorse an Amazon purchase, but
yeah, I've been sending the Barnes & Noble link. They got their own problems, but they're not as evil as
I always wonder about that because I try to use them. I'm like, is it the same thing? I don't even know.
I worked for Barnes & Noble for 4 years. I never had a heart attack on the floor. So there you go. I can vouch for them in that way, at least. Jordan Chariton, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
All right, guys. Have a good day,
Jordan.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Please clap.